Dementia Joe told the audience of the White House Correspondents Dinner that his opponent is a 6-year-old. Well, it's going to be pretty awkward to get your old behind handed to you by a 6-year-old then, fella. The show starts now. So the White House Correspondents Dinner happened over the weekend, and as is customary for presidents to do, Joe got up and read so-called jokes off of a teleprompter.
Of course, the 2024 election is in full swing. And yes, age is an issue. I'm a grown man running against a 6-year-old. Well, I feel great. I really feel great.
Pretty rich for the man who walks like a 6-year-old who just crapped his pants. But speaking of which, as an Axios scoop details, Joe's aides and staffers are now instructed to surround him when he exits Marine One and shuffles across the South Lawn. Apparently, this little act here will distract us from noticing how old, decrepit, and stiff he is. There aren't enough staffers in the world to accomplish this goal. May I suggest he starts taking a rascal scooter from now on, or perhaps they can just carry him? I don't know. Which actually brings me to the feel-good moment of the month, maybe the year. This Georgia State trooper picking up and carrying this psychopath, pro-terrorist like the petulant little pathetic child she is. You know, with all the bad going on in the USA today, it's videos like that that bring me comfort and so much joy. Joining me now to react to all of that and so much more is best-selling author, COVID buster, Alex Berenson. Alex, it's great to have you back.
Tomi, thanks for having me.
So you and I have talked before about all the COVID mayhem. So I think that maybe worlds are colliding here because it just so happens, Alex, that all of these or most of these pro-terrorists on college campuses also combine another favorite of theirs, which is wearing the mask. What do you think about that? I mean, is it because they don't want people to see who they are? Because a lot of them seem pretty proud of what they're doing. Or is it because they're still afraid of COVID? I'm not sure which one it is. What's your thought?
I do think that's a great question. I initially thought it was because they were afraid of COVID, but I've actually come around to the other side, that they sort of want deniability so that, some of these kids are not stupid. If the protests go, if it turns out to be a badge of honor that they participated in, they can say, hey, I was there in 2024 when we stood up against the, Israeli colonialists. But if it goes badly, they've got the mask to hide their face. So, I think they're playing both sides probably.
Yeah, speaking of playing both sides, I've said this many times, but I think it's going to get really awkward come June, Pride Month, when a lot of these same individuals who are now advocating for Hamas and Islamic terrorism are then having to decide if they're going to keep advocating for that or for LGBTQ and drag brunches. I think that the two are conflicting. I'm not sure they've understood that yet, but I think it's going to get real interesting once Pride Month comes. But a lot of these young people, they're supposed to be the best and the brightest. They're supposed to be these Ivy League students. They're out there acting a fool. They're out there in Columbia, pretty much every university, mostly in blue states, doing this. But what do you think about the differences in the way that red states are handling this and the way that blue states are handling this?
Look, I'm actually a very big believer in free speech. That is if it's not my absolute core value, it's way up there. So I do believe these kids should protest if they want. I mean, obviously, a lot of them have no idea what they're protesting for. They have no idea what Hamas stands for. But if they want to get out there and protest, and listen, I don't even have a problem with, I think a lot of the slogans are awful, but the idea of protesting is not that everybody's supposed to be comfortable when you're doing it, right? So I actually don't have a problem with that. My problem is that it's been very clear from the beginning that there's a different rule for pro-Hamas protesters or anti-Israeli protesters as for almost anybody else. So if you're Columbia, okay, and this is how you want things to be, that your central campus can get taken over for a couple weeks with tents. And by the way, of course, it's in April. It's when the weather's good. It wasn't in January that they were out protesting. Then you know what? If people want to protest against China or they want to protest in favor of the police or whatever it is that they want to protest for, that is their business and the rules need to apply. I don't particularly love the red states cracking down, but as long as they crack down hard on everybody, I have less of a problem with it than selective enforcement either way. Make the rules, stick to them. If the rules are this is going to be a peaceful campus and nobody's allowed to protest, even though, there's First Amendment issues with that. Again, I don't love that, but I don't have a problem with it as long as the rules are applied equally. And I actually have more faith in somebody like DeSantis to do that than the people who are running Columbia.
They're still doing protests in red states. It's just being handled differently. And I don't think it's a matter of, hey, you can't speak. I think it's more of a matter of you can't camp here. You can't disrupt, private property and thoroughways for people to move through. I think that that's where the line is drawn. But I'm curious your take on, this clip that's gotten, a lot of play because of its, disgusting qualities. This Columbia student who I believe has since kind of apologized and walked it back, but saying, that Zionists deserve to die. I want to play it and then get your thoughts on if this is in the free speech realm or not.
I'm Kamani James. I use he, she, they pronouns. Zionists in my DM wanting to meet up and fight. I don't fight to injure or for there to be a winner or loser. I fight to kill. See y'all in New York, January 2024.
So that's specifically what we're going to be discussing today. Do you see why that's problematic in any way?
No.
Do you think that there's a serious weight in taking someone else's life?
I think there is a serious weight in taking someone's life. And at the same time, I think that taking someone's life in certain case scenarios is necessary and better for the overall world. A lot of people agree that Hitler needed to die in order for world order to move forward and in order to establish some inkling of world peace. And so if we can agree as a society, as a collective, that some persons need to die if they have an ideology that results in the death of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions, if there are people like that who exist, shouldn't they die?
All right. Is that free speech? Or should he be on a watch list somewhere?
I mean, it's free speech. It's disgusting, obviously. And by the way, I'm not sure that Kamani is the person to be making, threats for a physical fight. I'm twice Kamani's age, and I take my chances against he, she, they. So it's big talk. Do I think that Kamani should be expelled from Columbia? Yes. Like, Columbia is a private university. They can set the outer limits, and saying that, essentially all Jews should die, because let's be honest, that's pretty much what he, she, they was saying there. I think going to Columbia is a privilege, and you've lost that privilege. My bigger problem than this child mouthing off is that Columbia did nothing about it, right? They did nothing about this. I believe that speech was made, or that video he made and posted in January. Columbia did nothing about this till the Daily Wire and other conservative groups busted them on it last week. So, I mean, that, you can imagine that if he had said that about any other group, the punishment would have been swift and he would have been expelled immediately. And so once again, we're in this position where there's one set of rules if you're saying, terrible things about Jews and I think white people generally, Jews specifically, and there's another set if you're saying terrible things about anybody else, and that is not okay.
It's also interesting to me the selective outrage over what they see as genocide. A lot of other people in the world, a lot of other groups that are experiencing that very thing, that very ethnic cleansing in China, for example. And these students, I have yet to see them protest for that. So it feels like it's just very much whatever the propaganda leads them to. And mostly it seems to be just an anti-white, anti-Western. And because Jews happen to be mostly white, it fits the narrative. It seems like that's more the common theme to me.
No, I certainly would agree with that, Tommy. And it's also quite true, as you said earlier on. I mean, a lot of these protesters, if they're gay, if they're bisexual, if they just say sort of anything that Hamas would not like. I mean, I don't know. Do they have any idea what the punishments they would face were they in Gaza? Were they in, the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan would be for them? It does seem like a lot of play acting and a lot of not realizing what the world is like.
Yeah, I think they call that LARPing, when people dress up in like the medieval costumes and they fight each other. That seems like what this is to me, but unfortunately, it's gotten a lot of political play. Our current president not saying much about it. These same people, of course, are outside all of his events, outside of the White House Correspondents Dinner. I mean, they're never going to go away because they've got a foothold now, and they're never going to give that up. I'm wondering, though, Biden's not being really forced to address the issue. He's not really being forced to address many issues. He doesn't do your typical interviews with typical organizations, even organizations that I would argue are very left-leaning, like the New York Times, which has complained about him not talking to them. But he did decide to go on Howard Stern, and he decides to go on these podcasts or talk to these, friendly pop culture hosts. So Howard Stern, I think, in the one way that he kind of backed him to a corner, and the only way I think he backed him to a corner was when he talked about debating Donald Trump, in which Joe Biden said he would be happy to do it. Let's play it just for the record.
I don't know if you're going to debate your opponent.
I am somewhere. I don't know when. I'm happy to debate him.
Is he stuck now? Does he have to debate?
It sounds to me like he agreed. I'm sure his handlers, wish he hadn't said that. But look, I thought in 2020 that Joe Biden couldn't win if he wouldn't debate. And I think that's even more true this time. He's got to get up on stage and prove to the country that he can at least stand upright, and think on his feet for 90 minutes. And if he can't do that, look, he shouldn't be president. I don't think that's a lot to ask of the guy who's got the nuclear code. So, and I'd say the same about Donald Trump.
Yeah, Donald Trump actually came out and said, I want to debate him anytime, anywhere. He even said, hey, listen, I'm going to be outside the courthouse tonight. If you want to come and do it here, you've got me here in all these political persecutions, so I'm happy to do it. So I think that's the one thing that the left can't say, is that Donald Trump is not up for a challenge, because Donald Trump doesn't back away from the press, doesn't back away from the media, doesn't back away from Joe Biden. I mean, in all these instances, he's willing to get up and do his thing, and the other side is not willing.
I absolutely agree with that, and I will say this. You mentioned sort of the softballs that Joe Biden gets. I think, and I've really watched the New York State, both the civil and the criminal cases, very closely. And honestly, it is disgusting that the media is not really explaining what has happened in either of those cases. That in the civil case, Donald Trump faces a $500 million penalty for loans that he took out and repaid fully with interest. Okay. And the state theory on why he owes money is just insane. All right. There's no other way to put it. It's insane and it's political. The case should never move forward. And the criminal case is worse. It is shocking to me that a case that is so legally and factually problematic was not tossed by the courts. Okay. And I guess look, I live in New York State. And I saw what happened last week with Harvey Weinstein, where that Harvey Weinstein's an incredibly unpopular person, understandably so. He certainly used his power to coerce a lot of women into having sex with him. We know that. And in 2020, he was convicted of rape, but the trial was very problematic. Okay, and what prosecutors were allowed to present was very problematic. And New York State's top court said last week, we can't allow this conviction to stand. It's not okay. Even though Harvey Weinstein's a bad guy, you don't go to prison for being a bad guy. And it's exactly the same thing with Donald Trump. People in New York State don't like Donald Trump. They want to do anything to get him. But in our justice system, you actually have to commit a crime to go to jail, okay? And prosecutors, when they charge people for nothing, it is terrible for the system. And it's really disgusting to me that serious news organizations are not really treating these cases with the skepticism that they clearly deserve.
Yeah, if I'm not wrong, they spent the entire last week just presenting evidence to why Donald Trump's a bad man, but really no evidence of the crime committed. So the fact that, as you mentioned, this is even going forward, you can't just say, oh, this guy's a playboy, oh, this guy had, NDAs, which are very common. You have to explain what the crime actually was, and I don't think that anybody's actually aware of what the crime is, but I'm worried that the judge is not relaying that to the jury, what is actually unlawful and what's actually illegal. Because I think the jury, if they're not familiar with non-disclosures or settlements, I'm not sure that they know or they have the proper instructions to make an informed decision here.
Totally agree with that, Tommy. And I would go one step further. What became clear to me last week was that the prosecution actually intends to make this case about the fact that Donald Trump won in 2016. Okay, that's explicit. What they're saying is he won because he suppressed information about these affairs that he had, okay, which he denies having. But let's just say that he had them, and let's say that the prosecution is correct. All right. Look what Hillary Clinton was doing in 2016. Her campaign was paying for a dossier filled with fake allegations against Donald Trump and then planting that in friendly news organizations. Okay. And I'm not saying that Hillary Clinton should be on trial for that. She shouldn't. This is politics. This is, it's a tough game. If you don't like it, don't be in it. But for prosecutors 8 years later to try to get a Democratic jury in a Democratic state to send the leading Republican candidate, the Republican candidate for president in 2024 to jail, to prison for stuff that happened 8 years ago it is really problematic. And I do think it's going to damage the justice system going forward, whether or not they wind up with a guilty conviction here. I think it's a big mistake.
Yeah, unfortunately, I don't think that they really care. I think they've got their eyes set on one thing, and it's scorched earth with everything else. Last thing I want to ask you is we got some reports over the weekend that I was really happy about, and that's that Donald Trump met with Governor Ron DeSantis. I know that you're a fan of Governor Ron DeSantis, especially for his handling of COVID. But this, to me, is encouraging. I don't know if he'll be a VP pick. There's some issues with that, being that they're both in Florida. But to me, it's encouraging that maybe they can bring the party together. Maybe we can see some collaboration. What are your thoughts on that? And do you think that if Donald Trump were to select Ron DeSantis as his running mate, do you think that that would be advantageous for both of them? What do you think?
See, that's the kind of political question I just don't know how to answer. I really liked, as you say, the way DeSantis ran Florida during COVID. I think he understood the science and the facts better than anybody, and he was very bold about it. I guess if he and Trump can mend fences, that's great. What the politics, whether that's the right person for Trump to pick or somebody else, that I wouldn't guess on. But I do admire DeSantis for the way he ran COVID, or Florida during COVID.
Yeah, no, to me, it just says if Donald Trump were to go that direction, I think it says, I'm not going to make a DEI pick. I'm not going to pick a puppy killer. I'm going to pick somebody that I think that actually could be effective in that role and then would be, the presumptive nominee for 2028, which as a DeSantis fan, that also makes me very excited. So for me, I think all good things. I don't know if it'll actually happen, that's the running mate or not, but I like to see the coming together, the unification. I think it's desperately needed. So I'm excited about that one. But Alex, I appreciate your time. I appreciate you still being a COVID warrior. There are still some people clinging on to COVID. So I appreciate you still being outspoken about that. And I hope to have you back soon.
Thanks, Tommy. Thanks so much for having me.
Good to have you. Folks, I worry about education in America for obvious reasons, but then a story like the one I'm about to share gives me a little hope that good can still come out of academia, my friends. As a part of a special class project, my next guest, a high school teacher out of right here in Tennessee, assigned his students a cold case from the 1980s to solve. And guess what? They not only solved it, but they were also able to identify several other Jane Does and the perpetrator in the case. This is what true crime dreams are made of. Joining me now with the whole story is East Tennessee high school teacher Alex Campbell. Alex, thank you for taking the time, or Mr. Campbell, maybe I should say. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely, anytime.
So, I read about this story on a number of different outlets. It got national attention, and even though it really happened in 2018, if I'm correct, but it got some national attention because this isn't something that you hear every day, a high school class able to solve a cold case murder. So I guess the obvious question that a lot of people have when just hearing about this story is, if the authorities couldn't solve it in the 1980s or in 30 years since, how did your high school class manage to make this happen?
That's a great question, and I believe it's probably multifaceted. Number one, when murders stop happening and there's no more crimes, sometimes those cases tend to be forgotten. Number two, I would say it's maybe some of the victims, the victim types. Many of them were runaways, drug addicts, maybe involved in the sex trade in some way. So sometimes those victims don't get as many resources. And I believe the case just kind of cooled off. DNA really wasn't an investigative tool back then. And so maybe I think the passage of time had allowed a few things to change. And it just seemed like the time was right to do some of that work.
For those that haven't dug into the case, there's a couple of different names that's been given: the Redhead murders, the Bible Belt strangler. Give me kind of a brief synopsis of what this case entailed and how your class went about solving it.
Yes, so you're right. There is a lot of confusion around the case, and that's where we started. If you look on Wikipedia, online, different sources, you'll find about 12 to 14 murders that took place between around 1978 and maybe the early 90s. In and around Tennessee. It wasn't just Tennessee. And so those are called the redhead murders. Many of those people are redheaded, but there's a lot of difference in those murders. And that was the real question. Was this just a series of one-off murders by 14 different people during this time? Or was maybe there a serial killer at work with some of these victims? And at the time, the police never really came to any kind of, They couldn't make up their mind. Was it one person, a few people? Was there a serial killer involved? And so that's what the students did. They found that 6 of these victims were most likely related to the same suspect. And so to help kind of distinguish between this larger group of victims and the victims who are related to one serial killer, they decided to give the serial killer a name, and that was the Bible Belt Strangler.
All right, well, that makes sense because we are, of course, in the Bible Belt. So your class, this sounds like a really interesting course to take, and it sounds like a lot of, real world application for people that might want to go into some kind of law enforcement or investigative career path. But after you guys solved this, how did you know that you solved it with certainty? And then what was the response from the authorities? What kind of reaction did you get? What kind of resolution? Did your class get any credit for this? I think a lot of people are really curious how this all ended.
Yeah, so what the students did in 2018 was they found that there had been an FBI profiler who created a profile of a person who murdered one of the victims, but that profile was gone. The FBI didn't have it, the TBI didn't have it, and the local law enforcement didn't have it. So the students decided to work with an FBI profiler to recreate this profile and say, for these 6 victims, this is the kind of person who would have killed them, and they give him the name, the Bible Belt Strangler. And so we described him. I think there was 20 some characteristics that the students laid out. The profiler agreed that he could not disagree with anything the students had come up with. He thought it was a great profile. So we released that. And then beginning a few months later and into the following year, they did identify the person who had killed one of those victims, and he fit the profile perfectly, exactly. And so now the work has really been to see if the person who killed Tina Farmer could have killed these other 5 women as well. And we're working to prove that. We feel that we have a lot of information that could at least prove 2 more. And we're hoping that one day law enforcement will be able to come out and say, yes, there was indeed a serial killer at work in Tennessee and surrounding states in mostly the late 70s to early 80s that killed multiple women.
And this person, this suspect, is no longer on planet Earth. Is that correct?
That is correct. He died actually shortly before the students began their research. He died in prison. He died in prison for attempting to murder another woman in Knoxville, Tennessee in 1983, I believe that was 1985. So yeah, he spent his life in prison, but only for a felonious assault. And he was never tied to any of these other murders. And the families were really never given any closure about who was responsible, and if so, what happened to him after those murders.
What interaction have you and your students had with the families of the victims? I'm sure that they were probably stunned to hear that a high school class was instrumental in giving them some closure.
Yes, I've spoken with many of the families, not all, but many of them. Some of them I stay close with. There was one survivor, stay close with her. And they were surprised because it had been over 30 years since there had been any leads or any changes or any updates in the cases when we started. And since 2018, when we started, there was only one of the 6 victims identified when we started. And as of about 2 months ago now, all 6 victims are identified. One of those families knows who killed their loved one. We feel that there's lots of evidence that shows maybe who killed a few of those other victims. So really, so much has happened since the students began about 6 years ago. And it's been great just to kind of see that unfold and help them.
So you've got to be a pretty popular teacher at the high school. I'm sure a lot of people want to take your class, and this is something that gives students a lot of enthusiasm. What has it been like for you as a teacher to see the excitement and the enthusiasm of your students when they're able to, make a real world impact?
Yeah, it really does depend on who you ask. These classes are really hard work. So there's no makeup days, goof off days, wear your pajamas days, movie days. I mean, there's only work days because this is important work. We've contacted families. We've talked to them. They're waiting on us to help them. So it is pretty tough work. And maybe that's not for every student, but we do get a good number of students who are willing to work hard. And the best part is really seeing our young people get the chance to work on meaningful work where they can help solve problems in the community and help people. And that for me is the best part of it. I love working with the students when they get those kind of opportunities.
Well, it's fantastic. And I'm so happy, that you're right here in Tennessee, giving these students this opportunity, making an impact not only on them, but on the wider community, the victims, and giving people some excitement about law enforcement and enforcing the law and bringing true justice to people who deserve it. So all good things in my book. I know that you've got a class to get to right now, but thank you so much for taking the time with me today. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you so much for, number one, holding up good work of our young people. I really believe in our young people. And number two, remembering these women as well and helping them get justice. So thank you so much for that.
Absolutely. Well, have a wonderful class, and God bless you and all your students.
All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Folks, Governor Kristi Noem of my home state of South Dakota bragged about shooting and killing her dog in a forthcoming book. And as a South Dakotan, an animal lover, and a human with a pulse, I am sickened. It's time for final thoughts. So when I saw the headlines regarding South Dakota Governor Kristi Noem's forthcoming book and the passage wherein she bragged about shooting and killing her dog, I thought this had to be a hit job because there's just no way someone who fancies herself a rising star of the GOP would admit to, write about, and boast about shooting and killing a dog. But then I read the leaked passage obtained by The Guardian, and damn, there it freaking is, folks. So Cricket wasn't a good hunting dog and wanted to play around instead of fetching birds, so you killed her. Okay, that makes sense to Jeffrey friggin' Dahmer and Charles Manson, but no one else. But Kristi tried to rationalize Cricket's execution by detailing a story about her killing her neighbor's chickens as if somehow a 14-month-old dog, an obviously poorly trained dog, her fault, killing chickens is unheard of or evidence of Cricket being too dangerous to live. No. Just know, if your dog is not well behaved and you are incapable of training her, give her to someone who can. But the most disgusting part of this whole thing is that Kristi tried to make this story a positive one for her, using it to prove she can make tough decisions and isn't afraid to take action. Kristi, in case this isn't abundantly obvious, your little story did not land well. But after I tweeted my utter disgust at this despicable and twisted flex, some in the comments tried to tell me that I don't get what it's like to live in rural America and that kind of thing is just a fact of life on the farm or the ranch. Again, bull. I'm from South Dakota, from a ranching family, and this is not typical or accepted behavior, so don't try to pull that card, Kristi. It might work with some of the city slickers, but it won't work with me. For those of you who don't know, not only am I from South Dakota, not only does my whole family still live in South Dakota, but I was also one of Kristi Noem's very first interns when she was elected as our Seoul House representative in 2010. She is not as well liked in South Dakota as the national media makes it seem, trust me. I think she's an embarrassment to South Dakota, and this dog execution story is just icing on that cake. She is not vice presidential material, and I hope Donald Trump stays far, far away from her. To recap, killing your dog does not make you a leader or a badass. It makes you heartless. And those are my final thoughts from Nashville. God bless and take care.